Welcome to The Debate. Today we're delving into the multifaceted paths to spiritual transformation presented in the Sons Aumen Israel library material. Our discussion really centers on a fundamental question. Is the most effective path to divinity and, well, spiritual liberation primarily achieved through renunciation and ascetic discipline, or is it through a deeper embrace and, let's say, sacred cultivation of embodied, generative life? I'll be arguing for the necessity of asceticism, detachment from worldly desires, and strict discipline as the direct route to spiritual purification and divine liberation.
And I, conversely, will present the case for integrating spiritual development with embodied experience, embracing physical life, communal flourishing, and these generative practices as well essential for deification and ultimately the creation of a perfected humanity, all drawing from the same very rich material.
Okay, so to begin, the Sons Aumen Israel library material. It strongly asserts that true spiritual progress and deification itself demands a profound detachment from worldly desires and rigorous self-discipline. And this isn't just presented as a preference. It involves actively renouncing possessions, controlling appetites, and really embracing a life of austerity as the means to achieve a higher state. The Holy Law 4, for instance, explicitly states, Know ye that no one can serve two masters. Thou canst not wish to have the world's riches and also have the theocracy of heaven. It goes on, wealth, lands, and power, these things belong to no one, for they are of the world. And there's a stark warning against, quote, storing up worldly goods, possessions, gold and silver, for these bring only corruption and death.
Quite direct.
Exactly. And this philosophy extends to direct action through things like vows of poverty. For instance, the Zadokian poverty consecration vow in Rule 24 mandates the full consecration of all possessions. Initiates have to learn to, and this is key, refuse to astrally identify and attach to physical objects and forms, instead seeing all things as offerings to be symbolically offered up unto Ahman, which is understood here as the sort of foundational divine principle. They're taught to give thanks, to be unburdened from the crutch and weight of personal property. I mean, that's a powerful statement, right? That liberation isn't found through accumulation, but by stripping away the temporal. We also see historical examples, like the Essene lifestyle described by Josephus. It involves renouncing pleasure, valuing continence and resistance to passions as a virtue. Essenes apparently disdain marriage for themselves. They despise riches and surrender all of their money and possessions into the common fund. They even, interestingly, regard oil as a defilement, preferring, dry skin and always wearing white garments. Self-control and purity are just paramount here. Patanjali's yama, the 5 commandments in Patanjali 6, include harmlessness, truth, abstention from theft, from incontinence, and from avarice. And niyama emphasizes internal and external purification, contentment, fiery aspiration, and so on. The golden verses of Pythagoras advise, avoid forbidden foods, because this contributes to the soul's purity. Furthermore, there's this concept of fire waters in Zadok 14, the waters of extended fasts, for these do burn all uncleanliness from bone, marrow, muscle, etc., highlighting physical purification through really rigorous means. Here, fire water seems to refer specifically to, water consumed during these long fasts, believed to have this intense cleansing effect. Even celibacy is presented as a valid, perhaps higher path. Yeshu acknowledges that chastity is not for everyone, only the few who feel so inclined, as it says in the Holy Essene Gospel 75. So it's indicating celibacy as a distinct route for certain aspirants. This consistent thread, I think, really underscores a path of profound detachment for spiritual ascent.
Right. And while that ascetic discipline you've outlined is certainly a powerful thread in the material, I'd argue it's far from the only path presented for deification. I mean, these same texts also lay out a really compelling case for a spiritual transformation that actually embraces embodied life, cultivating divine expression through the human form and collective effort, rather than, solely by withdrawing from them. It offers a deeply contrasting perspective, really. For instance, consider the section Becoming a God. It outlines establishing a fund for the replanting of a Garden of Eden and promoting firstborn truths through tithing and donations. This includes advocating for vegetarian dietary practices and alternative healing practices based on homegrown organic produce and herbs. Now, this isn't withdrawal, is it? It's an active, embodied, and communal effort to literally create a divine environment, a perfected earth.
Furthermore, the concept of the marriage mansion in Zadok 15 is quite explicit. It states, "You are to regenerate yourselves through sexual union often, for in the release of sexual energy, your light does penetrate all living things surrounding you." It even asserts, quite powerfully, that in very truth, the life of each planet thrives because of sexual energy given and taken by the men and women inhabiting it, highlighting a kind of cosmic significance to this generative act. I mean, that's a far cry from simple renunciation. It's really about sacred engagement with life's creative forces.
And this path extends to conscious procreation. Matriarchs are instructed to gain dominion over the cycles of conception, allowing for careful planning and principles of conception to, visualize, plan, conceive, gestate, birth, and rear children of highest intelligence, disposition, and physical strength and beauty. The ultimate goal being, quote, "a race of perfect beings shall abide upon the face of the earth," Zadok 15. And the very definition of purity gets expanded here. It says, "A matriarch shall have union with 1,000 patriarchs of purity. She is esteemed a virgin by the goddesses and gods," and so it is for the patriarchs. So within this specific context, the act itself doesn't defile. Sexual union is even described as a twofold worship, for things like enlightenment, creativity, imagination, incorporating music, dancing, fantasy, all for warmth of intimacy, wherein emotional, physical, and mental healing does take place, Zadok 15. These aren't acts of detachment. They are profound, sacred engagement, transforming physical intimacy into spiritual worship. The material even connects human procreation to divine creation, noting that upon quickening, which seems to be a kind of profound spiritual awakening, the inner cosmos is beheld, and immortals give birth to planets and suns, Zadok 15. And the hymn of Yeshu Maria includes that divine desire, "I would be born and I wish to give birth." So this holistic generative approach, it's just essential to deification other parts of the material.
Okay, your focus on the generative practices is clear, but how then do we reconcile that with the equally strong emphasis on purity and avoiding the pollution of the temple body found elsewhere? Zadok 16 warns against precisely that, pollution of the temple body. This really does seem to be a fundamental tension. Traditionally, preserving purity implies restraint, often abstention, which just appears fundamentally at odds with the extensive and frequent sexual union advocated within the marriage mansion context. How do we hold these seemingly contradictory ideas together?
Right, and I understand why you'd see a tension there. But the material itself, I think, provides a distinct and clarified definition for purity in this specific context, which directly addresses that concern. Zadok 16 explicitly states, "Fornication and adultery is the pollution of the temple body by taking of the waters of another not of this pure blood, and also by taking of food and drinks out of harmony with this pure blood." Now, it's crucial to grasp that pure blood here, in this Zadokian context, seems to refer specifically to adherence to a particular spiritual lineage and these harmonious dietary practices, not a conventional biological idea.
So, a redefinition of purity itself.
Exactly. It redefines purity away from general abstention towards specific adherence to lineage and, harmonious living. It's a fundamental reorientation, really shifting from an ideal of withdrawal to one of active engagement in a divinely aligned manner. Sacred lineage and conscious living become the measure, not simply physical continence. Within the marriage mansion, as I mentioned, union among patriarchs of purity and matriarchs of purity is explicitly stated as not diminishing their virginity. In the eyes of the gods, Zadokon. 16. Far from being impure, the amplified sexual light of mankind is presented as vital for sustaining planetary life, Zadok 15, thus purifying and elevating the act itself to a sacred, even cosmic function. It really seems to be about who is engaging and how within the right framework, rather than the physical act in isolation.
Okay, you've presented a compelling case for that redefinition within Zadok 16. But if purity is indeed about lineage and diet rather than abstinence, does that completely dissolve the tension for an individual who's striving for detachment from all worldly identification? Or is it perhaps just a different kind of engagement, one that still demands a very specific and disciplined approach to the physical? This, I think, still brings us back to the nature of deification itself. The language in Becoming a God, it emphasizes an accelerated and concentrated metamorphosis furnace for individuals, transforming Homo sapient man into something closer to the divine. Zadok 10. That sounds like a deeply individual journey, overcoming the enticing of the flesh and the dominion of the world to, quote, rise above the deeds of man and begin doing the deeds of deity. Zadok 10. How does this very individualistic journey of purification align with the collective focus on creating a perfect race through specific reproductive practices and communal living? They almost seem like two distinct modes of reaching that higher state.
That's a crucial point, and I believe the material actually presents deification as both an individual and a collective endeavor, with each supporting and accelerating the other in a way. The Church of the Firstborn, for example, is described not just as a refuge for the faithful, but explicitly as a schoolhouse for the development of spiritual gifts for those who want to be perfect. By striving to live higher and deeper spiritual laws today, Zadok 10. This strongly implies a collective setting where individual transformation contributes to and is supported by a community focused on a shared grander goal.
A supportive structure.
Precisely. The individual's metamorphosis isn't isolated. It's interwoven with the collective purpose. The marriage mansion, again, explicitly states that power will begin to abide amongst you, a power that shall act as a great magnet that shall pull elect and wondrous intelligence from each of you and place it in each of you and into the fruit of your loins. Zadok 15. Leading directly, it says, to a race of perfect beings. So individual spiritual growth, divine intelligence, it's amplified and then externalized through these collective generative acts. Moreover, that individual quickening that reveals the inner cosmos where immortals supposedly give birth to planets, Zadok 15, that directly links individual spiritual evolution to these grand, collective, generative acts on a cosmic scale.
The overarching aim stated in Zadok 34 is to assist in the creation of my divine heir, which seems to perfectly blend individual attainment with collective deification into a single integrated process. It's perhaps not either or, but both and.
While I appreciate the argument for synergy, it still feels like the material, in places, stresses a starker distinction between the individual's spiritual battle against worldly pull and these collective embodied projects. Which brings me to a final point of, let's say, contention, the role of material possessions and worldly engagement. Those strong warnings against worldly goods, the Essene practices of communal property and disdain for riches, Josephus, Holy Law 4, they seem to present a pretty clear rejection of material accumulation. Have no anxiety about storing up worldly goods. Gold and silver, for these bring only corruption and death, Holy Law 4. How can this be reconciled with the, frankly, practical necessity to establish kibbutz-like Zionistic communities and fund firstborn organizations through substantial tithing? We're talking 11% to 22% of income mentioned in Zadok 10. This requires significant engagement with and management of material resources, which just appears to fundamentally contradict the renunciative ideal I've been highlighting.
Yes, and I think the material makes another crucial distinction here. One that isn't necessarily a contradiction, but perhaps a more nuanced approach to the material world, based on intent and collective purpose. It seems to distinguish sharply between individual accumulation for self-serving desires, which yes, is clearly condemned, and the collective stewardship of resources for the benefit and, well, propagation of the holy order. The establishment of that fund for the replanting of a Garden of Eden and the support for firstborn organizations and practices, Zadok 10, it demonstrates a purposed engagement with material resources.
So, intent matters?
Critically, yes. It's not a rejection of the material world per se, but rather a sanctification and a communal redirection of it. The directive that the children of light who labor in the garden of Sons Aumen Israel abide in the holy law, Holy Law 6, seems to indicate that productive communal labor within a sacred context is actually part of the divine path, not a distraction from it. So it suggests a shift, maybe, from individual ownership for personal gain to a collective, sacred management of the earthly mother's resources, all aimed at building this divine society and supporting its generative practices. It really comes down to intention and communal purpose, transforming what might look like worldly engagement into an act of divine service.
Well, as we've explored today, the path to divinity outlined in the Sons Auman Israel library material is clearly far from singular. I've presented the, I think, compelling case for an ascetic, renunciative approach, emphasizing detachment from worldly ties, strict self-discipline as fundamental to spiritual ascent and that individual transformation. This perspective is deeply rooted in those warnings against worldly goods, the examples of austere lifestyles, and the calls for profound self-control and purity, all seemingly geared toward shedding the temporal to reveal the divine within.
And I, in turn, have tried to illuminate a path that consciously embraces embodied existence, communal generation, and even sacred sexual energies, not seeing them as worldly distractions, but as potent forces for deification and the creation of a perfected lineage and planet. This generative path views the physical and social realms as active arenas for divine expression and collective spiritual evolution, where engagement, when properly consecrated, of course, becomes an act of worship itself.
Right. Both perspectives definitely draw on deep, sometimes seemingly contradictory, wisdom within the text. It showcases that the pursuit of divinity is remarkably complex, often requiring principles that appear to be in opposition to somehow converge, or at least find their appropriate context within a larger, more comprehensive framework. It certainly compels us to consider whether true divinity might actually encompass both withdrawal and profound engagement, not as contradictions, perhaps, but as complementary expressions of a singular, multifaceted truth.
Indeed, it's quite a testament, I think, to the depth of these teachings that they present such seemingly disparate paths, challenging our, conventional notions of spiritual progress. Whether it's through strict renunciation of personal attachment or through the conscious, sacred cultivation of physical and communal life for a higher purpose, the ultimate goal seems to remain the transformation of humanity into something, closer to the divine. The material certainly invites us to consider how these different, yet perhaps equally valid spiritual frameworks contribute to a fuller understanding of human potential and divine destiny. There's clearly much more to explore within these rich teachings.